Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to this seminar called Power and European Integration, the Role of Germany. Let me first say that this is the last seminar of the Europe program this semester. And I would also, to the readers in Swedish, I would like to say that we have a new essay, Finns det hopp för EU? So please buy it, read it, and think about whether there's hope for the European Union during Christmas time. This seminar is part of our wider series called Room for Reform, where we discuss the future of the European Union and the different reform suggestions and the room for reform, and we will continue with that also during spring, so please come back for these issues. The theme for today is, as I said, Power and European Integration, the Role of Germany. One of the clearest trends in European integration during the past years is the increasingly dominant role played by Germany. And there are, of course, different reasons for this. One is the kind of crisis management mood of the European Union itself the last years, which gives more room for the member states in general, and perhaps for Germany specifically. Also because Germany has a very strong kind of power base, and looking especially at its economy. You could also argue that Germany is perhaps the only player who could bridge some of the gaps in Europe today, the one between North and South, created by the Euro crisis and its management, and the gap between West and East in the area of migration, for example. This issue is even more pressing after the UK's decision, or at least vote, aiming to leave the European Union, because leadership is also about who else could lead. France has its problems, its internal reforms, and now the UK is on its way out. So Germany is even more dominating in the leadership roles. Finally, you could argue that there's a Trump effect. Many have argued that Europe will have to take care of more of its own problems than it would have before, and also perhaps invest more in a liberal global order than it has before. And also that is something that people count on Germany for, and perhaps in particular on Angela Merkel. Now, can Germany lead? Who will follow? And in what areas could Germany lead? And with whom? What kind of partners does Germany need for effective leadership in Europe and elsewhere? And I have a guest today, we have a guest today who's very well suited to discuss these issues. That's Daniela Schwarzer, Director of the German Council of Foreign Relations, DGAP. So please join me in an applaud for her and inviting her to speak. And the floor is yours, Daniela.
Thank you very much, Björn, Mats. Thank you for having me here. It's a great pleasure to be here in Stockholm today. And I think as Björn has sketched out in a few sentences, we are not in an easy situation. We are in a situation where, in terms of foreign and European policy, many questions are open. And I've never personally witnessed a period where many sessions simply consist in raising questions about what might happen, and one hardly comes to the point where one discusses strategy, what to do, because so many things seem open at this point. And of course, much of this is because of the upcoming political changes, the recent election in the United States. So I'm very pleased to be here to discuss Germany's role in the European Union and possibly also internationally. And let me briefly start by giving you my short version of what happened to Germany in the European Union over the past years, and what were the major points where I think the European Union and Berlin realized simultaneously that something was indeed changing, that Germany was moving into a situation of power and of leadership. And I would also like to speak about how Berlin is to some extent struggling with this new role, which is obviously full of ambition, but also full of expectations from the other side. And then I will in the end try to indeed answer the questions you raised, Björn, about how does Germany think about its own leadership, with whom, how, what are the tools, and to which end. Now, the whole issue of German leadership in the European Union, as you may recall, really made news as of 2010, when the Eurozone was slowly but surely gliding into a pretty deep new round of crisis, when the sovereign debt and banking crisis hit Greece and then spilled over to other countries. And Germany at that point, first of all, was pretty strongly criticized, namely for not moving fast enough, for looking at the situation in the eyes of many in a too slow and maybe too thorough way, and not being an activist who would jump in and do something overnight. So the first few months of 2010 were actually a situation where there were big expectations to Germany. And Germany was slow, as I said, and there are various reasons which I'm happy to discuss. But what really showed in that moment is that nothing much can happen without Germany. And it was only until April that there was a first decision to actually promise liquidity aid to Greece in a pretty ad hoc fashion when the Eurozone didn't have the necessary tools. There was no mechanism to actually do this. So this was very much invented between the governments and kind of overnight when the crisis really sharpened. And of course, the pivotal player at that point was the German government, which at some point said, yes, we understand this is a systemic crisis and we do need to do something. Now, what are the foundations of this sudden new power position? First of all, obviously Germany's economic weight. If you look at the Eurozone, Germany makes up for 27% of the GDP of the Eurozone, and if you put France together in that basket, it's actually 47%, so almost half of the Eurozone economy is covered by 2 countries alone. Secondly, and that is really important to understand also for any discussion going forward on Eurozone issues, one thing at that point was to observe how the government's perception of the Eurozone crisis evolved. But it wasn't only an executive decision, but in order to engage Germany in any kind of rescue package for Greece and then later for other countries, and in the formation of the European Stability Mechanism, which was then created as a lasting institution, the German government needs parliamentary approval. So every single step of rescue decision in the Eurozone, and those really tense crisis weeks and days, had to be approved by the German Bundestag. And that explains to some extent why the German government may be much slower than other governments, because parliament has to be taken along, and this in a very thorough way. Secondly, there were and still are very serious constitutional, at least questions, if not constraints, as to how far Germany can engage in ways of stabilizing the Eurozone. So actually, for instance, the question whether the European Stability Mechanism could be installed and invented had to be at some point also decided upon by the Constitutional Court. And the parliament, some parliamentarians, of course, used this fact that the Constitutional Court had something to say to threaten that they would actually take single decisions to the court. So that explains why the domestic political and legal constraints in Germany on Eurozone issues were and still are pretty tight. Now, why is this so and different from other countries? One of the reasons is that there was a Constitutional Court decision in the 1990s on the Maastricht Treaty, which created the euro. And again, there were opponents to this idea to give up the Deutschmark, and the Constitutional Court at the time had to decide whether the way the monetary union was set up would be in sync with German constitutional principles. And one of the points in the court ruling was that actually it was okay for Germany to adopt the euro because the central bank is independent, because it is supposed to be a stability union, which was very much modeled on the way Germany's monetary policy and economic order worked. And thirdly, because there is a no bailout clause in the treaty. And that is crucial. It's actually upon that base that our parliament in the 1990s decided to adopt the euro. Now, the whole question of the Eurozone crisis raised the issue whether the rescue help for Greece was actually a bailout. And if it had been, it wouldn't be in sync with those principles. So that's important context to know. And I'm going into some detail into this because for our discussion, where might Germany take the Eurozone at some point? What are the proposals that Germany would be willing to engage in? All have to be assessed against this background. So it's not that a future government after our general elections next year can just do anything, but the constraints, both politically and constitutionally, are pretty well defined. Now, so since that year, and I'm coming back to the narrative of Germany's power in Europe, there were years where Germany was seen as the power center because of that specific experience in 2010 where everything seemed to depend on Berlin. And this evolved for a number of years. Now, from a Berlin perspective, this situation was not at all sought. Actually, you can see from some of the speeches that German policymakers gave in those years following this moment of deep Eurozone crisis, that on the one hand, there's a constant deep commitment to keeping Europe together, to holding the euro as a currency, and to developing the European Union further. And also, there's a sense of responsibility in what policymakers say about their own role in Europe. But there is always a narrative about we do not want to lead alone. Said in more diplomatic terms, speaking about the partners, speaking about whom Germany is working with. But the situation didn't become easier because Germany's strength was also a function of the weakness of its partners. Now, the one country to name here, which is crucial for Germany's way of thinking about Europe, is France. And I think one can say, by looking back at the past few years at least, that there has been no major Franco-German initiative. Of course, both countries were crucial in crisis management, and I do not wish to suggest that the relationship isn't relevant. It has been very relevant in reacting to many of the difficult moments that Europe has gone through. But there hasn't been a moment where both of them, together with a bigger group, would have launched any big substantive initiative. This is not only, of course, a function of the domestic political situation in France, but to some extent, I think it's an important variable to look at it that way. But also an assessment of the overall political situation in Europe, because you don't want to launch yourself into a big proposal knowing that this will not fly with anyone. So I think more than ever before, over the past years, have those people who traditionally would like to bring Europe forward and would have good ideas what to do, have they looked at electoral calendars here and there? And so France, obviously, and Germany are both going for general elections next year. Presidential elections and parliamentary elections in France, and general elections in Germany a few months later. And I think until then, it is pretty clear that crisis management will go on if it has to, but we should not expect that anything larger or bigger may happen. Now, sort of looking at the other partners, and Björn, that was one of the questions you raised both in the invitation and in your introduction. Who else is there? Obviously, Germany works very closely with Poland. There's a trilateral format between France, Germany, and Poland called the Weimar Triangle. But this, frankly, has become quite difficult since the change of government in Poland, where on the Polish side, a number of questions were raised, first of all, as to the Polish-German relationship, but then also as to the vision that Poland wishes to pursue for Europe. So I think this is at least a trilateral format or a bilateral format, which at this point in time has some, let's say, common ground when it comes to security issues. But there we don't necessarily talk EU, but rather NATO. But it's very difficult sort of on the key EU integration questions. That brings me to the United Kingdom. Now, the decision of British voters to opt for Brexit was a big shock for Berlin. A big shock not only because it was largely unexpected, but also because, from a German perspective, the UK is really an important pillar of European integration, despite the fact that, like Sweden, the UK is not in the Eurozone, but from a German perspective, Britain is, first of all, a country which has been crucial as a partner to Germany in building economic integration, building the single market, pushing this forward. So there's a strong overlap of perceptions how to economically push forward with European integration. But then also, Germany, to some extent, has relied on the very strong foreign policy and security policy role that the United Kingdom traditionally took. Of course, it didn't go unnoticed that way before the British referendum, the UK disengaged to some extent from its previously very strong international role, which again can be pulled back on domestic conditions and circumstances. But from a Berlin perspective, the decision of the UK to leave the European Union still is one that is deeply regretted. But that doesn't mean that automatically the strategy is still to accommodate the United Kingdom as much as possible, but rather, and here's another interest that Germany pursues in the European Union, there is a very, very strong wish and interest not to make the Brexit case a good example for anyone else in the European Union. So I would say that policymakers in Berlin think very hard about how to, at least as far as Germany can, because it's the European Commission negotiating Brexit, how to take a position that on the one hand doesn't make it attractive for other countries to follow the British example, but on the other hand, everyone knows, of course, that the UK is a very, very important player in foreign and security policy terms, as I said, economically, with a financial center in London. So a separation which would weaken either the UK or the EU, or both, more than necessary, would be something that no one would wish for. So there's this, this very difficult balance to strike in the approach to Brexit. If I had to put it in one sentence, what the major concern in Berlin is these days when one talks about the future of Europe, it's not a big next ambitious project, but it's keeping the EU together. So the centrifugal forces in the European Union are not underestimated at all. And Berlin knows very well that it is among the very few governments which, with a comparatively stable domestic situation, can possibly take still a lead. But it knows as well that it cannot lead against anyone. It needs partners to move things forward. And I think one important episode to mention in that context is the learnings that the German government had to draw from the way it handled the migration crisis in the European Union. As you may remember, in the year 2015, in summer, the Chancellor took a very liberal and open position and said, we can welcome large numbers, in that case of Syrians, but obviously broader groups of refugees to our country. Now, Germany got a lot of criticism for that position and was blamed for actually inviting people and making people move, so that people actually decided to leave their homes in the Middle East or elsewhere to come to Europe because of Merkel. I think the other side of the story is that at that point when those statements were made, many, many people were on the move. And from the Berlin perspective, there was one big risk entailed by this movement of people through Greece, through the Balkan route, into Central and Eastern Europe. And that was the fear that if those flows continue and somehow don't move on, and Germany felt it could be a place where some large numbers could be welcomed, that this would lead to a closing down of borders along the Balkan route. And this actually then happened. So when Merkel said what she said about inviting the Syrians who at the time were stranded in Budapest in Hungary at the train station, one of the objectives, it seems to me, was really to take pressure off Hungary and the region and say, we can take them in, with the clear intent to prevent borders from going up again within the European Union. As I said, this did not succeed. So we have border controls where we didn't used to have them. But I do believe that Germany's approach since then has been to find European solutions that would allow us together to go back to the previous conditions of open borders within the European Union. The attention on the migration issue in Berlin has shifted very quickly from making it possible to welcome as many people as possible from other EU countries to Germany to limiting the inflow of migrants into the European Union. And there I see a pretty strong alignment of German interests with other countries' interests. While it was for a long time said Germany is doing everything completely alone and it's not seeing what the others are doing, I think the deal that was prepared by Chancellor Merkel and then became a European Union deal with Turkey actually shows that also from a German perspective, the goal is to limit immigration to the European Union in a way that actually the selection of true asylum seekers becomes possible, and that the right to asylum is not constrained, but that there is a stronger degree of actually making sure who comes and knowing who actually is already there. I would say today, the situation in Germany, which for a month, because of about 1 million arriving in 2015 alone, was very tense in Germany, in a positive and in a negative sense. In the negative sense, obviously a lot of criticism of the government and many stories showing fear and showing dysfunctionalities of welcoming refugees, hosting them, etc. But on the other side, there was a huge civic engagement in Germany, which came completely unexpected, and I think which remains something that one should very closely look at. So society engaged to an extent which I have never seen before, and it's still going on. However, in this situation, we also saw the rise of a far-right populist party, the AfD, which wasn't created because of the migration crisis. It was created in the Greek crisis years, and that's why I emphasize the domestic politics of Euro rescue policies. But this party completely changed its orientation, and now is essentially an anti-immigrant party, an anti-Muslim party, xenophobic, and obviously it has broadened its scope of positions, is a really sort of societal, from a societal perspective, anti-liberal party. AfD so far has made it into half of Germany's regional parliaments and has a very high chance to make it into the federal parliament next fall. And that is, of course, something that German policymakers haven't seen that way. If AfD scores at the current polling data score, it would have 12, maybe 14% in the German parliament, which would really change the domestic political debate. And I will maybe conclude with that for time reasons, but I'm looking forward to questions. I suppose that Germany is normalizing in some way compared to other major EU countries, or also smaller EU countries, and that our own debate on Europe has become much more controversial and politicized, and Europe, in my view, will play a much larger role in the electoral campaigns before the elections actually happen next, either late September or early October. So we will have a real discussion on where Europe is going, and Germany will continuously have a discussion on its own role in that. As I said, German policymakers, they want to shape, they want to take responsibility, but they don't want to be seen as sole leaders. And that's why there are a number of interesting speeches. Our defense minister coined the expression leading from the center to show that Germany always defines itself as part of a broader group. But it's, of course, closely noticed by Berlin that the group of like-minded countries is not growing at the moment. And I started with the extent of insecurity that we are facing, and I'll close on that. Obviously, a major role in the German debate on its own international responsibility and its role in European integration is, of course, the way the United States will look at Europe and at Germany and at global governance. And a lot is at stake for us in Europe, for all of us. And from a Berlin perspective, the specific question here is, of course, can we rely on this relationship? Because much of Germany's understanding of its own international role is really very solidly anchored not only in Europe, but also as being part of a very close transatlantic relationship. Only this made it possible for Germany to take this very strong stance vis-à-vis Russia in the Normandy format together with the French. And if this broke away, in whichever way, and we can discuss what possible scenarios are, the challenge for Berlin to be what some said the leader of the West, which I find totally exaggerated, but still the impression is there that Merkel is the last woman standing. And that is obviously a situation that Berlin policymakers hope will change as soon as possible, because while the commitment to European integration and close transatlantic relations is very strong, the understanding is always that Germany cannot lead anything alone. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Daniela. We'll soon open up for discussion with the audience. I have just a few questions for you first. Starting with the Eurozone, and it's interesting you pointed out that Germany and France amounts to almost half the GDP of the Eurozone. If we fast forward and look at the scenario after the elections, and perhaps we will have Fillon and economically somewhat liberal and a social conservative, could be a match if Merkel as well stays in the game, which seems very likely. Is there different scope for the reform of the Eurozone, or will still this constitutional aspect that you mentioned be a barrier to reform? Mm-hmm. I mean, we see that the urge for reform is not really as strong as it was a couple of years ago. Possibly because we have other crises to look at for the moment, but the kind of structural imbalances that were clear to see during the Euro crisis are to some extent still there. So what do you see if we look in perhaps a 2-year perspective? Will be the different scope for reform?
Yes. Well, my first sort of additional point to your analysis why it's not at the forefront of political agendas at this moment is that the ECB took on a large responsibility for crisis management, which took pressure of policymakers to act, and they were very happy about it. And that's sort of where principles are in conflict with each other from a German perspective. So there are many critics of the ECB's role in the Eurozone, because simply it really went very far in stabilizing the whole setup. There could have been an alternative early on. That would have been some kind of government-led stabilization efforts through fiscal means rather than monetary means. And Germany was not at all ready to do more than was actually done. Now, why? I mentioned the constitutional principles. They, of course, stay in place. The other element is a political one, and that is this worry that if you do too much in terms of building solidarity mechanisms and stabilization mechanisms that can benefit other countries, you disincentivate reforms. And this is where France, and by the way, also Italy comes in a very important way. It's very difficult from a political perspective to tell German parliamentarians, voters, whoever you want, media, that Germany should move ahead with Eurozone integration if the group of like-minded, let's say, Nordic countries seems quite small, and then you have the southern Europeans who seem to want some degree of fiscal solidarity, some degree of risk sharing through maybe a Eurobond, and then the completion of banking union. Because the feeling in Berlin is very strongly that you cannot avoid that the incentives change for governments so that they are incentivized to free ride on those mechanisms. And that's why, if anything happens, and I hope it will because the Eurozone architecture rests incomplete, the Germans will always argue for stronger and more effective control mechanisms. Now, political control mechanisms are there through the various rules and procedures to work on high deficits and debt levels and economic competitiveness, the imbalance question here. From a German perspective, while we are criticized for the large surplus, it's really a problem of competitiveness of others. So, there has to be a counterpart here, that if we change the mechanisms, the others move to a situation where they can perform in a better way. So for Germany, this idea of solidarity doesn't go without more self-responsibility. And I've spoken about the rules-based framework. A lot can be said about how dysfunctional it has been over the past years. And that's why in the sort of backdrop of German thinking about the Eurozone, there's a recurrent theme, and Schäuble brought it up as early as 2010, our finance minister, for the first time. He said, maybe we need an insolvency procedure. Basically, in my words now, arguing that if a country really risks going bankrupt and there's no insurance that the others will pay, this will discipline decision makers in a different way. And I think what's behind this thinking is a comparison with the US model, where you have some kind of federal budget, and on the other hand, a huge sort of self-responsibility for states who can actually go bankrupt on their own finances. And I think this thinking of having a market mechanism in addition to a rules-based mechanism, it's something that might come up again if you ask me about a way forward. And the other component is, of course, that if Fillon, because you asked precisely for the Franco-German relationship here, if he indeed manages to put France into a better economic shape, and I think France is partially better than it seems, but pushes some important reforms that yet haven't been implemented, that this would make the bilateral cooperation easier again.
Talking about also Germany and France, if I may jump to Russia. Germany stands out as the kind of the guardian of a tougher line against Russia, one which Sweden, of course, supports. But will this role hold with after the elections as well? I mean, again, Fillon has taken a different stake, and we see the UK is they've already been on the way out, and now if they're leaving, is there still policy space for room for a tough stance? The sanctions, but also the continuation of relations, for example, with Russia. How will it impact on them?
Well, it really depends on the results of the elections, but I think what can safely be said, it's that the Grand Coalition, so the Christian Democrats and the SPD, very broadly agree on the necessity of having a double track. One is the hard position on sanctions and linking them to the implementation of the Minsk agreements. And I don't see wobbling here among the two major parties. And the other consensus is very deep in Germany, and some have criticized it for being too deep. It is that Russia is seen from a geographic perspective, obviously, as a neighbor who won't go away. So we can't forever live in a confrontational mood. At some point, we have to work as hard as we can to have an approach which opens space for a different kind of relationship. Obviously, you also have the so-called Russlandversteher, the Russian understanders in Germany, who for deep cultural or deep political or deep economic ties basically say this is the only thing to do and forget the sanctions. But I would say this is a group of people who receive more media attention than they actually have impact at this point. If I think through potential government coalitions after the next general elections, I don't think that Germany itself risks completely changing its stance on Russia. I don't believe that. But the question is, of course, how likely is it that the whole EU can be held together on the sanction regime? And France is one crucial player. I do think that the picture is obviously very complex, because when you think about French-Russia relations, the major concern here is not Ukraine, but the Middle East and Syria. So what may happen is that the overall agenda in the EU-Russia relationship will become more complex and broader, and depending on how the United States play their role, maybe the attention shifts from Russia, Ukraine to Syria and the Middle East. And in that case, obviously, more countries in Southern Europe will be more likely to argue for a softer stance. Final point, Italy. We don't know what happens after Renzi. And Italy is also a country where you've heard both voices. Stop the sanctions, continue. So the picture will only be clearer, in my view, at the end of 2017.
You did touch upon domestic issues in Germany, considering the leadership role, and one novelty here will be the entrance of Martin Schulz back into German domestic politics. What do you think? What will be the effects? Especially, he has a very strong line when it comes to EU, and that is, I mean, his credibility. And this has been something that Angela Merkel has, to a large extent, been running the EU policy. Will that change now?
Well, first
at least
of all,
during the months leading up to the election, I guess.
Yeah. Well, so I think that the question is more general and less about the person. And I think what did happen over the past years was a shift, to some extent, of EU issues from the Foreign Office to the Chancellor's Office. And some of this was driven by the mere number and depth of crisis, which really required the direct attention of the Chancellor, but also to some extent, an order of priorities in the foreign ministry which focused on other things. But the foreign ministry still remains a key player, for instance, when it comes to all questions of EU reform, institutions, and all those questions. They are deeply rooted in the foreign ministry. Now, unless something happened today in terms of news, it's very hard to know who will run as the candidate of the Social Democratic Party in Germany. And there are rumors it could be Martin Schulz, the EP president, or it could be Sigmar Gabriel, our current Minister of the Economy, and the party chairman of the SPD. Now, if it were Martin Schulz, of course, this would put even more emphasis on the European issue. And I would say that in any case, the Social Democrats would include a very strong position on the future of Europe in their campaign, simply because the issue is so pressing. But if it were Martin Schulz, I would suppose that the whole topic of the institutional functioning of Brussels, the role of democracy, given his deep background in the European Parliament, would play an even stronger role. And to some extent, it would be good, because I think we risk at this point, and I'm not only speaking about the German public, but of any country in the European Union, there is so much criticism of the EU and Brussels, which comes from the far left or far right populist side of the political spectrum, that the moderate parties have a very hard time in arguing what is actually good about Europe and why we need it. And I do think that a person like Martin Schulz has a very different way of dealing with those issues, because it has been his daily life for a very long number of years. So he would probably make it an even stronger case, which I think for a country like Germany, which so deeply depends on openness in the European Union, of economic system integration, the single currency. Our own foreign policy is completely defined through the prism of Europe. If you look at the German Foreign Policy Review, that's one of the major conclusions. Of course, we have a national foreign policy, but the prism is always with European partners, and if possible, where we have instruments in place through the European Union. And I think people, yes, need to be confronted with this reality as much as possible.
Thank you. Well, over to the audience. Please raise your hands, and we have microphones on both sides. Please, we have front row first here.
Hi, I'm Mark Reinhardt. I'm a researcher here at the Institute and a professor at Stockholm University. It's an honor to have you here and to hear this talk. Like a good movie, you ended on a twist, on a cliffhanger, if you will. You said that Germany has been exercising this influence and this leadership role, but it won't do so. It doesn't want to do so without partners. But of course, I don't see in the foreseeable future any partners coming online, so to speak. So it begs the question, how sustainable is this leadership? And I'd like to hear from you, what are the conditions or the scenarios by which Germany would actually abdicate responsibility or be forced to sort of step down? Is it a major economic crisis? Change in parties? What exactly would it be?
Thanks very much. Yeah. So I think what will happen is that obviously Germany is hoping for partners, and the French elections, Björn mentioned, are key here. And I do believe that there will be a strong attempt to revive this bilateral relationship as at least having two who push forward. But then there are other countries, and I think we are in one of them, where there is a very clear overlap of interests on a number of issues. You mentioned Russia. I think it's also true that the approach to the migration issue is not so dissimilar. And there are other issues. I mean, there are also conflictual points, but I think there's a common ground. And what Germany is facing is a new situation, and that is changing partners, because we have an East-West divide, we have a North-South divide, there are other issues which make the world even more messy in terms of geographic dividing lines. And I think Berlin is slowly but surely realizing that even if the Franco-German relationship comes back as a strong engine of pushing things forward, the task is huge to talk to as many as possible. and try to bring as many countries as possible in. Now, in order to make this sustainable, maybe one thing has to happen, and that is a refocusing at some point on Brussels. Because what happened since the Eurozone crisis started was an increasingly intergovernmental way of managing the crisis. Obviously, it happened at summits, it happened in Brussels, it happened under the moderation and impact of the EU institutions. But we did face at least a certain period of very strong intergovernmentalism. And as I said, Germany in that phase was in a real power position. It was a veto player. Nothing worked without Germany. And the migration crisis showed that's not happening anymore. So Germany wasn't able to push other countries along to really implement and accept the quota system on taking in asylum seekers. So that clearly shows that simply the tools are not in place to lead against anyone, right? And yeah, this is something that Berlin is acutely aware of, and we are not in a hegemonic situation here, and it's not a question of will; it's just a question of facts. Germany doesn't have the power base to push forward whichever way it wants. So I think what sort of to not end on a completely negative note is that I think the nature of the European Union will change. And in this process of obviously partial disintegration, because the UK is very likely going to leave, maybe there is some more disintegration somewhere, but there may also be some more deepening, in particular in the Eurozone. The picture gets more complex, but I think a number of countries will be pushed to a point where they have to really think hard. Do we want to continue being the spoilers, or do we, after all, see a huge interest in being part of this club and making it work? And maybe there is really, if you asked to think down the line a few years on, maybe we will see a process of countries having to take that position and deciding for themselves whether they want to stay in the euro, whether they want to leave, whether they want to stay in Schengen, whether they want to leave. And after all, maybe we have a European Union in the end, which is more loosely integrated for a large number of countries and more closely integrated for a core. I personally believe that if we want to keep the single currency, there has to be deeper integration. And that means, and that's sort of something interesting, again, speaking to what Germany is ready to give, because that's also a resource of leadership, that you're willing to concede on some of your positions. That's going to be a very hard call for Germany. On the question, do we accept that the Eurozone turns out to be an economic model which is not entirely modeled on ours, which works in a different way? And secondly, are we willing to give up sovereignty? That may happen as well. If we deepen the Eurozone, of course, Germany has to give up sovereignty to stronger European institutions. And those questions, I can give you answers from a sort of think tank perspective. What do I think is the right policy? But the politics of this have never been as unforeseeable as they are now.
But you said the spoilers will need to make up their mind. Should there be more pressure on also non-Euro countries to join the Eurozone?
I don't think that is frankly, I don't want to offend Sweden, but I don't think that's a crucial question at the moment, because the whole question is the sustainability of the monetary union. Some countries joined in the midst of the crisis, like some Baltic states, and they did so mainly because of geopolitical and security considerations. There is no need for the Eurozone to enlarge to be more sustainable. There's no link. It's really a question whether we internally in the Eurozone are able to keep this complicated setup of countries which economically don't entirely fit together. But if we don't, that will be very relevant for Sweden, but not the question of joining. So,
question here, and then. Emergency microphone is on its way.
Is it working? Okay. Johan Hennegren, I'm a former EU Commission official. I'd like to ask you about defence. You said that Germany is normalising, perhaps not in that area, but I was wondering, given the possible weakening of the transatlantic link with a future President Trump, the UK leaving the the EU and being one of the important military players in Europe. Do you see any prospect of Germany sort of beefing up its military strength to make it commensurate with its economic power, and perhaps also becoming, how shall I say, propagating or speaking in favour of a stronger common defence policy in the European Union in the years to come? For instance, bringing its military spending up to 2% of GDP, which I don't think it is at the moment.
Well, the German military spending at this point is at 1.2%, so there's some room to reach the NATO goals, basically. I mean, the German government did subscribe to them. Obviously not next year, but in a multi-year horizon. I think it's important to see that the German government, including the public to some extent, has gone through a reflection process not only as to Germany's foreign policy role, but also its defense and security policy approach. So we have had 3 years of strategic reflection, starting with the foreign policy review and then adding the defense white book. Now, I think the major thing to take away from that is, first of all, a certain new ambition, which obviously is very much driven by the changing international context. And part of that context is the rising pressure from our allies. Now, within the European Union, the criticism of low defense spending, and in the transatlantic relationship, obviously the same thing within the NATO framework. The situation now with President-elect Trump has accelerated this. I would argue that the same sentiment, but not to the same degree, would be in Berlin if Hillary Clinton had won, because also the Democrats have started messaging and it was expected that she would take that position at some point. So the pressure's felt. Just to give you a little tiny sort of number, the 2017 budget has an increase of the defense budget of 6 to 7% in a year-on-year comparison. Obviously, this doesn't change the GDP ratio as quickly as our partners would want to see it happen, but I would say the trend or the track is already engaged. But from a German perspective, the emphasis, in my view, will continue to be defense spending is one thing, but foreign policy, security policy, development policy, all those things have to be looked at together. And Germany is comparatively strong on other areas. The foreign policy budget has been strongly increased. We have a pretty solid development policy budget. So it's this package that Germany likes to put forward. And I assume that while it will engage with European partners to strengthen the EU defense policy, maybe not in an EU, but in a smaller group framework, at the same time, it will continue to argue that we have other means to engage internationally as well. And it's obviously, from an American perspective, the debate very quickly zooms in on just the defense budget number. And that's something, in terms of political communication, the German government has tried to broaden the perspective. It hasn't really worked. So it lives with the criticism, but it's moving at the same time.
My name is Ingmar Ullberg, working at this institute. Could you say anything about Germany's relations with its big nearest neighbor to the east, namely Poland? Earlier you had quite cozy relations with that state, but now they have a new moral conservative government. There is the refugee issue and also the topical issue of Nord Stream 2, where there are different views. Could you say anything about that? Yes.
Well, it is not an easy bilateral relationship since the last elections in Poland and the change of government. Initially, from a Berlin perspective, as far as I could observe it, the German approach was to stay very calm and see what happens first. You know, not to criticize, not to push or anything. And there was a phase which was not so nice because there was a lot of anti-German rhetoric in the media, but also triggered by a few politicians. The German approach was not to comment or react or push back, just to, Obviously, on the government level, the usual consultations go on. But it is very apparent now that when you look soberly at the positions that the Polish government has taken and the German government has for a while, I would say the closest overlap is probably in terms of security, defense, and Russia. And here, everything works pretty well. I don't think that Berlin at this point looks at Poland as a driver of a further deepening of the European Union. There are more questions at this point as to, for instance, how Poland thinks of the Visegrad 4 countries, whether this is a format, because there has been recently more engagement in that regional framework, whether this is something that is actually going to engage for changing the European Union for the better, or whether this is a format that predominantly blocks others from doing something. So those are open questions. And as I said earlier on, Germany's approach has been, under the previous government, to really work the trilateral format, so the Weimar Triangle, and to have a close bilateral relationship with Poland. And this is seen as something that one would want to have. But if there's very little joint preferences on the agenda, you can keep up the formats, but you won't push anything forward in the European framework at this point. And you mentioned Nord Stream. I think that's one of the most complicated issues, not only from a Polish perspective, but also from a Baltic perspective, and I suppose from a Swedish perspective as well. I can only tell you what I hear in Berlin, and that is, and believe it or not, of course, the position that this is not a political project, but a business project. Obviously, the implications of this are very, very political, both for EU countries, but also for Ukraine. And I think that is an issue which needs further discussion between Germany and its partners, because even though it is depicted as a project of businesses, if the partners look at it as a very political project, the government at some point needs to engage in a way that it doesn't become too controversial. And that's, I think, what's happening at the moment.
Well, I have also my name is Michael Suhlman. I'm chairman of the board of this institute. I also have a question about Eastern Europe, following up Ingmar's line of thought. There are not only the Polish-German relations, it's a question of the development, or whatever one should call it, of democracy in both Poland and Hungary and certain other countries. To what extent is Germany prepared to take a more active line on those? Then you have the discussion we have had here, and that is, there are some countries who thrive on solidarity in terms of regional support, but they are not willing to show solidarity when it came to the migration problems, the refugees. So should one not enter into the equation our financial support for these countries? Is that kind of discussion in Germany? Second question, is there any discussion about the European Partnership Program? You have just published an excellent analytical report, your institute, but in wider circles, because we see involvement from the rest of the EU in this program. Sweden was and still is very active in that direction, but the results are, to put it mildly, mitigated, and in Moldova rather catastrophic, actually, in terms of success for European values, where we have been lining up with well-known oligarchs of most dubious CVs. Well, is there any discussion about? Of course, this is a marginal problem among others, but it's not unimportant for us. We are putting in quite some resources into these areas. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I wouldn't call it a marginal problem. Let me start with the approach towards backsliding democracies, to put it in a succinct term. Well, I think the statement that Chancellor Merkel made when she congratulated Donald Trump on his election victory, I read it, but that's my personal view, as a statement directed towards the president-elect in the United States, but also a statement directed towards Europe, at least some in Europe. She reminded of the values underlying the transatlantic relationship and under which conditions Germany would like to work with the United States. And it was a very, very strong statement, which was the reason why then we had all this discussion, is this the last country standing up for Western values? Which it's not, because we are precisely in another one. But there is, of course, a huge caution. Let me put it that way in Berlin. There's a huge concern. As I said, the approach to the Polish government was extremely cautious. And there was no public naming or shaming of, for instance, the reforms that the PiS government pushed through Christmas time last year, when things happened very quickly, and we include myself, we're all pretty shocked by what's happening in our neighboring country. But it seems that the government decided to, while it continues to remind of the value base and the importance of liberal society and democracy, doesn't go into an open confrontation, but leaves this to the procedures engaged by the European Commission. I think we seriously need a discussion on whether this is fruitful, because we see basically after the Hungarian case and the Polish case no immediate effect politically of changing policies in those countries. And indeed, you mentioned one idea, which is also one discussed in Berlin, but I can't comment, or because I simply don't know, whether this will be a position adopted by the government to link financial support through EU funds to actually the quality of democracy in the countries. It's an idea which is around more in the think tank sphere than I've heard it from government officials. I haven't really. So we'll see whether the EU is ready to move there. But again, Germany can only be one country pushing this. And the more problems we have of that kind in the European Union, the more difficult it will be. Right? Of course, again, we have a symmetry to the Eurozone discussion because Germany is the largest net payer, so obviously a little more weight to its political position, but it's open for me. But I do believe we have to think very seriously about this specific problem. Now, your remarks on the Eastern Partnership, I think this is one of the biggest puzzles for everyone in the European Union who worries about our eastern neighborhood and the potential for transition. And you mentioned Moldova. From a German perspective, obviously the three frontrunners, Georgia, Moldova, and Ukraine, are important to have proof of a functioning neighborhood policy, just like for Sweden and any other country that engages. And I remember that Sweden and I think Poland were the ones who invented the Eastern Partnership as a concept. Germany is committed to this, and this is no specific German view, I think the general view is becoming that unless the dynamic really come from the countries themselves, we cannot do anything. We cannot just go there and transform. We can only support. And in my view, if you take Moldova as a case, with the recent presidential election, I think we have to think even more long-term than we did so far. And that is really think about working with civil society, with opposition, with anyone else, build relationships, but then wait. They have to elect their leadership. We can't in any way influence that. Ukraine, of course, from a German perspective, high on the priority list, not only through the Normandy format and the Russian, Ukrainian, French, German approach to the crisis, but also in terms of supporting transition. But again, there is a huge worry that if US foreign policy towards Russia changes in a way that the European leverage is weakened in the region, then we will face a very serious situation of not being able to do much. So I hear people, not in government, but really in the think tank sphere, the discussion has completely shifted since the elections in the US, that we are suddenly discussing concepts of spheres of influence, and then the question, where do they belong? And the Russians, I just witnessed that being in Moscow 3 days ago, are ready to start those discussions, and this is something that is very far from the way we like to think about the region, because we consider them as sovereign states. But that's, I think, one of the major challenges the EU will have to face. But maybe on a sort of more positive note, we tend to forget, but with all the crises we discuss within Europe, that the European Union is still something that people want to join. And that's the other point which is important on Germany's EU policy agenda, and that is enlargement. So the commitment to the Balkan countries is still pretty important and pretty large, and the support and the personal attention that the Chancellor and the Foreign Minister put into that is continuous. And I think that's important to see in the context, of course, because if we talk about Russian influence in the eastern neighborhood and deliberate destabilization, this to some extent is also true for the Balkans. And this is well known, and I think the political engagement to help those countries transform and transition is not broken at all in Germany.
Well, Daniela, our time is up today. I want to thank you so much for coming to Stockholm, discussing these issues. These are, of course, very important from a Swedish perspective. So we will follow this debates further. Also very happy that you ended on a very happy note, or positive note at least. So thank you very much for coming to Stockholm, and I hope to see you here again soon.
Thank you.